This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime, the co-lead defense attorney for Stephen Avery in the Netflix binge-watched series Making a Murderer, talks the case and then looks back at justice in a time of terror involving immigrants in the early 1900s, just as we currently are in an age of terror and suffering some rising anti-immigrant hostilities. We'll say those who do not study history are destined to repeat it. That's all tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Dean Strang is a criminal defense attorney, Madison, Wisconsin. He's also an adjunct professor at the law schools of the University of Wisconsin, Marquette University as well. Together with co-defense lawyer Jerry Buting, a recent guest on this show as well, they provided the defense for Stephen Avery in the case portrayed in Making a Murderer. He's also a graduate of Dartmouth, where I got my MBA, so we're promising not to hold the fact that he's a lawyer against him. The book, Worse Than the Devil, Anarchist, Clarence Darrow, and Justice in a Time of Terror. Welcome, Dane. Good to have you on.
My gosh, I'm the third Making a Murderer lawyer that you had.
That's our quota.
Maybe the third time's a charm.
Well, I was going to say, this completes our triumvirate. We had Jerry and Ken Kratz, who was the lead prosecutor in the case. And this is where I want to start first, is with Making a Murderer, and then we'll move on to your book. And I want to kind of give perspective and see what you think. To me, it seems that the documentary that was put together into those 10 episodes did a brilliant job of showing the unfairness in many ways of the law against those without resources, low-income folks, and not exactly portraying the case 100% as it is, so much as portraying that, which sort of gives ended up sort of a more sympathetic to Stephen Avery than maybe he is as a person, and we'll talk later about the guilt, et cetera, or not. But do you get a sense that, this image that he was white trash and the family was on the other side of the tracks, that the documentary did a great job of how justice is often unjust for them, but maybe the case itself took a little bit of backseat?
Well, usually the only criminal cases we tune into publicly are the rarest of the rare that involve a well-to-do defendant. So people were transfixed by the recent Bill Cosby trial.
Yeah.
O.J. Simpson remains fascinating 20-plus years later. Martha Stewart, Dennis Kozlowski, the Tyco exec. These are the trials that draw attention. But the vast majority of trials in our criminal courts, state and federal, no matter where you are in this country, have unmoneyed defendants and unmoneyed victims, for that matter. So something like Making a Murderer, for that matter, Adnan Syed's case, for example, in the first season of Serial, the podcast, something like these cases is much more the norm in our criminal justice system. So to investigate them, to bring them to the public attention, I think is inescapably to see the skew of the system against people who are impoverished, in not just financially, but impoverished in any number of ways: education, language skills, mental health, whatever it might be. So it's not to say that the filmmaking wasn't skillful here. I think it was. I'm not a filmmaker, but it was gripping. To me, it kept your interest. It is to say that almost any, examination of a mine-run criminal case would confront the viewer with the effects of poverty.
Very interesting. Well said. And I'm glad you mentioned Kozlowski, by the way, because we, along with 60 Minutes, are the only broadcast entities that have got interviews with him. I got right after he got out of prison. It's a fascinating story, and actually, he's a good guy and was primarily wrongly convicted, I think. Not that it wasn't greedy and that kind of thing, but legally, I think he was sort of railroaded.
And I didn't mean to pick.
No, I know.
Richard Scrushy, Rod Blagojevich.
Yes, those guys are bad dudes.
It's the rich and powerful whose cases we tend, to see on TV or in the newspaper, and those are a vanishingly small percentage of, the 12 million plus criminal cases in this country every year.
Now, of course, the other side there was the nature of coerced confessions. And in this case, we had I don't know if mentally impaired is a fair statement, but it was recently vacated, and it was, I think, vacated in your book we'll talk about as well coming up. Talk a little bit about coerced confessions and really how Brendan Dassey, who may be guilty but was completely exploited by this process.
Well, after police departments came to be, and that's a relatively recent phenomenon, that's sort of mid-19th century, that the idea of a standing police department came to be. After that happened for some decades in the United States and probably elsewhere, the police often used physical coercion or duress to elicit a confession, to encourage somebody to confess. And finally, in the mid-1930s, the United States Supreme Court said that's not consistent with due process. You can't offer a physically coerced confession into evidence at a trial any longer. And what that did, in 1936, 1937, when the U.S. Supreme Court announced that rule, what that did is give police departments an incentive to look for means of inducing confessions that didn't involve a truncheon or a sap or being held incommunicado for a long time or sleep deprivation and sort of crude physical duress. And what followed in the 1950s and early 1960s were psychological techniques. And it's taken us some decades to realize that while an improvement, psychological measures employed by skilled interrogators against unskilled and, often mentally disabled or unsophisticated, inexperienced, or mentally ill people in custody can have the same coercive effects that physical techniques can have. And Brendan Dassey, unfortunately, again, is much closer to a norm than the cases we might normally focus on or that get publicity typically. Lots and lots of people aged 15 to 25 are drawn into the criminal justice system. That's the likely time for males to become involved in the criminal justice system. And many of those people are not a match intellectually or as a matter of mental health and life experience, not even close to a match with police officers. So many of the psychological techniques that police officers have been trained to use since the 50s are not likely to produce a false confession. Many of them are relatively safe or reliable in that sense. But some of them that are incorporated into the Reed technique, which has been the dominant paradigm for police interviews in custody since the 60s, a few of those psychological techniques present an enormous, or at least to me, unacceptable risk of inducing a false confession. A ploy called the false friend, where a police officer pretends to be an ally, a confidant, a trusted advisor to the person in custody, can produce a false admission. Have somebody admitting something in the hope of pleasing the new friend that he didn't actually do. I think even riskier is the technique of telling someone in custody that the police have evidence the police, in fact, don't have. A couple of quick examples.
By the way, that's legal too, I'm told.
These are legal. The courts have accepted these techniques. Now, or at least said, look, in and of themselves, they're not enough to make a confession inadmissibly coerced. In combination, they may be, given all the circumstances. But yes, courts have have allowed the police to employ these stratagems. So the false claims of evidence might be, hey, Billy, we've got your fingerprints on the cash register, and here you're sitting denying that you were involved in the robbery, when in fact the police don't have any fingerprints. Or, hey, Jim, your buddy Billy down the hall is spilling his guts.
Yeah.
He's blaming it all on you. And, we think he was the main guy in all this, so you better speak up and tell us the truth, otherwise you're going down and he's walking. When in fact, again, the supposed accomplice is not giving a confession or hasn't given one. And that's a very, very risky stratagem, because for many people in custody, what it does is cause them to think, if I talk, maybe I'll get 5 years. Or if I'm lucky, probation. If I don't talk, if I don't tell this officer what she wants to hear, I'm going to get 10 years or 15 or worse. So it becomes a cost-benefit analysis on a set of false premises, and that can lead to false confessions. It certainly leads to coerced or involuntary confessions. And I think in Brendan Dassey's case, you had both. You had an involuntary confession and one that turned out to be false. Now, the truth or falsity of a confession isn't really supposed to matter legally. The question is whether it's voluntary or involuntary. It doesn't matter if it's true or false, because the idea is, as a matter of human dignity, we ought to have the choice whether voluntarily to confess or not. But one of the reasons for disallowing involuntary confessions is so that we don't get false and unreliable statements being introduced in court and end up convicting somebody on a confession when in fact he committed no crime.
It was interesting to me. Ken Krantz had told me to go listen to I don't know if it's 4 hours, but the entire tapes, because on Making a Murder there's only a small segment. I'll see that they did not. I will see it was not coerced, and I'll see that Brendan knew exactly what he was talking about. And I watched it, and, I hear them saying things like, Brendan, if you tell us the truth right now, we're going to protect you. You'll be all right, which is clearly not true. And that Brendan himself says they got inside my head. Now, he says stuff that certainly implicates himself that other people wouldn't know. For instance, his reach under the hood of the RAV4, and that there was sweat-related DNA found there. Which is not blood, not finding blood. So he said stuff that didn't look good, but he definitely feel like they were abusing him, and he never had a lawyer with him.
That's right, and and I've heard him say that before. I think that's what I would be saying if I were a prosecutor, and indeed there's some fairness to that. Don't look at an excerpt of something, look at the whole of it.
Yeah.
For me, having watched more than once all 3 hours and 45 minutes or whatever it is of that final March 1 statement, for me, watching the whole of it only makes it worse, not better. And, again, and this is understandably hard for people who aren't judges or lawyers to grasp, but the question is not supposed to be, did he get it right? Did he not get it right? Is it true? Is it false? The question is supposed to be, is he making a free choice to speak and to incriminate himself? It's very tempting to go past that to, well, gee, is this the real perpetrator? Is he involved or not? But it really is an unacceptable cost, at least the U.S. Supreme Court has said, and I agree, to human dignity, to use such trickery that the statement no longer is freely given, and that gets tied to a real risk that the statement also is false, because someone's giving it to please the questioner or to gain some expected benefit, whatever it may be.
Now, Dean, if in fact Dassey were to be guilty, would you still feel that his coerced confession should vacate any finding of guilt, regardless of whether he is guilty?
Yes. And let me explain that. The relief that Brendan has gotten in the federal courts is not that he should walk free. Mm-hmm. It's that he should have a new trial at which an involuntary confession is not admissible. Now, Brendan gave other statements in custody that no one is contending were involuntary. There's, some, not much, but some other evidence that the state could offer if it chose to retry Brendan Dassey. Mm-hmm. And in many other cases, there's a good deal of other evidence that's not elicited involuntarily from the defendant's own mouth.
Why wouldn't he be?
The issue is.
Why wouldn't he be? Sorry to interrupt. Why wouldn't he be released right now with a vacated decision?
Well, that's a fair question. And the Seventh Circuit has said, look, you were convicted in the state courts. Your conviction was upheld through the state courts. Yes, we, the federal courts, now have ordered a new trial, but the state still has the right to challenge our rulings, to take it to the full Court of Appeals or take it to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Oh, I see.
So we're going to leave the status quo in place.
Okay.
For now, we're going to show a bit of deference to the state court judgment, even though we think it rests on an impermissible basis.
All right, let me ask you this. We got about 3 minutes to go on this segment, and then we'll finish up with Making a Murderer. There were, and this I got from Ken. There were signs. There were signs that didn't look good for Avery that I didn't really get out of the series, and I've seen it twice now. I did not know that he had initially claimed she never even came to the property that day. That he denied there was any fire, even though her electronics were in his burn barrel, which is in the front of the yard. He said he was home alone. And you would think he would have said, no, I was with Brendan Dassey if he wanted to establish an alibi. And those things kind of struck me. The other thing, which is purely, I understand, not admissible, was he did have a fair amount of history that didn't look good in terms of rape, domestic violence, threatening to kill his wife. There was some stuff on Jody. But and then there's all the blood evidence as well. You put that together, he doesn't quite look as sympathetic.
Well, I don't want to dance around this, Jim, but yes. I think in fairness, I have to say, Ken Kratz, I think, has gone back and reread this trial transcript, 10 years after we tried the case. I've not. I haven't written a book about the case. I'm not going to write a book about the case.
Yes, I understand.
I've got, I got my own cases and life and interest to pursue now. So I am at a disadvantage in recalling specific items of evidence, and I also know that Ken Kratz hasn't always been an accurate reporter of exactly what the evidence was or what the information was that wasn't introduced in court. In
fact, he made that, in my mind, that huge error when he first said that he knew what happened, that it had no bearing on what actually happened. I mean, that seems sort of abusive.
It was, and I'm not here to throw stones at Ken Kratz or anybody else. That's just by way of explanation that I'm at some disadvantage here in parsing evidence in a now 10-and-a-half-year-old trial.
That's fair.
That said, I have a pretty clear recollection, Jim, that at the trial there were no inconsistent statements by Stephen Avery offered by the state. There were offering Stephen Avery said this, and then the facts turned out to be that, was not a significant part of the state's case, if a part at all, at trial. And, I'm not going to pit my unrefreshed recollection against anyone else's refreshed recollection, but I don't have any recollection, that said, of Stephen Avery ever denying that he had a fire.
Okay. Very fair, and obviously you and Jerry did a tremendous job representing him and that family. You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, coming from our flagship station, WGCH Greenwich, 1490 AM. Coming next, Anarchists and Injustice. And we're back with Dean Strang, attorney, and we're going to talk about a book that he's written, Interesting History, Worse Than the Devil, Anarchist, Clarence Darrow, and Justice in a Time of Terror. And we're not talking necessarily about today, so it's going back a bit. I want to ask you first, most of us don't understand what anarchists are or what they were at that time. Give us a little bit about the backstory and why you chose to write it.
Boy, we could go for a long time if you want to discourse on what anarchists were, but
the short version, Dean.
Sure. In the late 19th century and the first couple of decades of the 20th century, I think anarchism was the dominant radical ideology with which Americans and their law enforcement agencies grappled. Philosophical anarchism dates back to the early 19th century, even late 18th century, and simply means that all relationships should be voluntary, as between individuals. Government ought not exist. Every one of our relationships, each with the other, ought to be voluntary as free and equal people. And then, that's the philosophical roots of it. As that grew and took on really interesting different ethnic sort of stripes through the 19th century, some of anarchist doctrine became quite militant, advocated violence as a means of catalyzing social change that would eliminate repressive governments or repressive business arrangements, capitalism, which was seen as impinging on the voluntary relationships of individuals and their equality. So in its more militant or violent forms of dogma, anarchism became a real concern of the government and law enforcement in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Anarchists in particular were feared and reviled as the country was spooling up to become involved in World War I. I think the second part of your question is, why did I write about it?
Yeah, and tell us, get into the story a bit as to what happens.
Sure, yeah. My first book here is a fairly local story in one sense about a group of Italian immigrants in Milwaukee who were charged with a relatively minor melee in an Italian neighborhood surrounding a large rolling mill that employed many of the Italian immigrants in the area. But then while they were in jail, someone placed a bomb at the church of the minister who was the state's star witness in that fracas that was to go on trial. The 11 Italians charged in that fracas all were in jail and couldn't have planted the bomb. But because the bomb was, placed at the church of the state star witness, their supporters, and they, by extension, were blamed for it. And the bomb eventually blew up not at the church, but at the central police station in Milwaukee. It caused the greatest loss of police life in American history until September 11, 2001. 9 officers died in the bomb blast and 1 civilian. So the Italians went on trial a day or two after the last of the police funerals in an atmosphere of really intense antipathy to radicals, to Italians generally, and outrage at the destruction of police life and the police station. And the book covers then that trial and its aftermath. It arises from my interest as a sort of an amateur legal historian in how outsiders, newcomers, people at the margins of society fare in our courts during times of elevated nationalism, patriotism, fear of terror. And World War I, that era is a real good time to look at those questions. It's distant enough from our own time that we have some objectivity about it, but all of those factors, the fear, active radical ideology, frequent acts of violence, political violence, and a sort of nationalism and patriotism that swept the country as we prepared for and then went to war, all are a good time to look at how our courts fare or how they function under those pressures.
And essentially, it was almost a proxy trial for a crime that they could not have committed. I
would remove the almost.
Okay.
Nominally, the charges were about this street fight 2.5 months earlier. In actuality, the district attorney made it a trial about the bombing of the police station and just the danger of people who were seen as foreign, anti-American, and having strange habits and a radical bent of mind. So the district attorney injected the bombing into the trial at every possible opportunity. And it was a proxy proceeding in the sense that no one was actually ever arrested for the bombing. That was a crime that went unsolved.
And at the same time, they also tried them all together. Was that an abuse as well? I assume they were not all conspiracy folks anyway, right? Some of them had nothing to do with the other, or were they all connected somehow?
They all lived in the same neighborhood, and that really was the only connection they had. That and their ethnicity. They were all Italian by birth. Some had been in the country for a number of years. Some had come very recently. But they were all tried together. It was a very vague conspiracy charge. When I set out to write this book, Jim, I thought it would be a book about conspiracy and the risks of that theory of prosecution, and there are many, and they're still trenchant. They still matter. We still haven't solved the riddle of how to contain conspiracies so that very peripheral or even innocent players aren't swept up into and punished as if they were the principal authors of a crime. But the more I got into it, the less I wanted to write a book just for lawyers or one that was terribly technical. And, I thought the broader themes that I've just described in the end were much more compelling to me and I hoped would be to readers as well.
And you wrote it yourself?
Yes, I wrote it myself.
It's very well written. I was wondering if you had any help.
Well, I may be a Dartmouth grad, but I'm moderately literate. I'm no Yale grad. I understand that. But I'm moderately literate. I can sort of carry a conversation at least at an 8th grade level.
Yeah, all these Ivy Leaguers are overrated.
Well overrated.
The appeals process here also was pretty ugly. And talk about that. And Clarence Darrow is a very famous guy, but how does he relate to the case?
Well, he took the appeal. That's the hook for this first book that gives it a little bit more national interest. Darrow, of course, probably remains America's most famous trial lawyer, and he's known as exactly that, a trial lawyer. We don't think of him as an appellate lawyer. Mm-hmm. In the main, he was not, but he took 60-plus, or had 60-plus published decisions on appeal over the course of a fairly long career. This was one of them. So he didn't try the case, didn't represent the 11 defendants at trial, but did represent all 11 of them on appeal. And it was probably a tainted appeal, or at least there was, I think, an effort made jointly by the district attorney and others in the district attorney's office and Darrow to corrupt the process of the appeal.
And you mentioned that he was charged with juror bribery, so he was not a straight and narrow guy?
That remains a robust debate. What is clear is that, yes, Clarence Darrow twice stood trial in Los Angeles in 1911 and 1912 for allegations of tampering with the same jury. He had two trials. They tried the counts against him separately, back to back. He was the jury hung. The jury acquitted him on the first and hung on the second.
Mm-hmm.
So, that remains a lively topic among people who are interested in Darrow, and there are still books coming out. There's at least 6 or 8 books out about Darrow and his life just in the last decade. So I think it's fair. It's fair to conclude that this is a man for whom his ends sometimes justified unethical or even unlawful means.
This notion that when we have fear in the country, we don't necessarily behave in our, adhere to our democratic values. Do you see similarities to the story that you wrote about it to what's going on now with travel bans and worries, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic kind of sentiments rising?
Well, I see some echoes of this all, through much of American history.
Yeah.
You see it in the World War I era. You see it, some of the same problems arising in our courts again immediately after World War II, as the Cold War begins, and we have the Smith Act and the real fear of communist infiltration. You see it with the Civil Rights Movement. You see it with the anti-Vietnam War era.
Mm-hmm.
I think you certainly see it after September 11. And for me, at least, the point of practicing history, the point of studying history, the work of the historian is to help us see the present in the past.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point, I think, of studying history and trying to write it.
Do you see similarities with Making a Murderer too? Because these folks were low income, had no power, trouble speaking English in many cases. Do you see similarities there?
Only in the broadest sense, because again, no money,
yeah.
Difficulty navigating social systems. That's the norm. That's the rule.
Kind of scary.
In criminal cases, anything else is a rare exception.
At the end of this, the public doesn't seem in your book as aroused as it was. Was it kind of by the end of the sentiments by Americans or the folks there had sort of soothed a little bit?
Well, by the end, you say by the time the Wisconsin Supreme Court reversed 9 out of the 11.
Yeah, it didn't seem to generate the way as much controversy.
It didn't. For one, the war was over. It was 1919, spring in 1919 or late winter 1919 by the time the convictions were reversed. So the war had been over for several months. And number two, I think not to be overlooked, but I don't want to overstate it.
Mm-hmm.
We just had newspapers then, and they came out in the morning, they came out in the afternoon, but
no internet.
There wasn't an internet. There wasn't a 24-hour news cycle. There wasn't cable talk programs. So just the technology that provides oxygen to stories today didn't exist in the same way.
Do you have any idea who put the bomb in the church that ended up exploding in the police headquarters?
Only derivatively do I have an idea. America's leading scholar on anarchism, who died maybe 10 years ago now, was a professor named Paul Avery in New York. And Avery drew the conclusion that a master bomb maker named Mario Buda from Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, from Italy, but spent most of his time in America in Western Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
Avery concludes that Buda probably built the bomb. Now, he's the man who built the bomb that exploded on Wall Street near the J.P. Morgan's bank in September 1920. He was with either Sacco or Vanzetti, one or the other, the night they were arrested.
Interesting.
There's no question Buddha was a very skillful bomb maker, but Professor Average didn't document well why he drew the conclusion that Buddha built this bomb. So, I have no reason to doubt his conclusion. I just can't confirm it independently. I wasn't able to.
We have a couple minutes left in this segment. I don't know if I knew this or not, but at the same time that this is going on, right, Teddy Roosevelt is actually shot in Milwaukee.
No, that was a few years earlier.
That was earlier? Okay. But it was in Milwaukee?
It was in Milwaukee, absolutely, at outside the Hotel Gilpatrick. The bullet hit him square in the chest, but happened to hit a silver cigarette lighter in his vest pocket and his folded-up speech for the evening. So he had a hell of a bruise, and in fact, I think it broke skin.
Who shot him? Who was that? Who was responsible?
A German-speaking immigrant named John Strang, who clearly had mental problems, and indeed was found not guilty by reason of insanity at a stipulated trial and went off to a mental hospital.
In the last minute, the prosecutor was a guy named Zabel in the case you wrote about. Was he harassed at the end of the process? And I guess he was involved in the fix. I know Ken Kratz said that he's had 4,000 death threats since Making a Murderer. Did Zabel go through some of that?
Zabel probably had something like that. He described it as a bushel of threats during the trial, and then very seriously, some months after the trial, as the appeal process was beginning, 2 bombs were placed aside his house. They were found by the police before they exploded, but one on each side of his house. So he very much was under, intense pressure and was threatened.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We've got our final segment coming up. We'll look at reforming our criminal justice system. And Dean's book, again, is Worse Than the Devil, Anarchist, Clarence Darrow, and Justice in a Time of Terror. And we're back for our final segment with defense attorney and co-star of Making a Murderer, Dean Strang. Maybe I sound naive still, but you've made a great point in your book and in Making a Murderer of, whether justice is hard to come by if you have low income, not the powerful. Is equal justice under the law in the U.S. a misnomer, and is it fixable?
It certainly remains the right aspiration.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we'll ever attain it, but I do know that we have to keep reaching for it and that it's worth reaching for. I know we've made progress. I know we've got a long way to go.
Okay, let's go over some of these things. I've interviewed a guy from the Central Park Five, spoken with Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito. All of them were coerced. Amanda Knox, Rafael not so much, but the Central Park Five definitely. Are there things we can do that will make sure there's no coercive confession?
There are things, again, we can do to make real progress on that. I think first, and maybe foremost, we can move away from the confrontational interrogation technique like Reed, the Reed technique. And the good news is, in the United States, we're finally beginning to do that. The second largest private trainer of police officers' interview techniques now is no longer teaching Reed or any other confrontational technique. The rest of the English-speaking world already has migrated away from confrontational techniques like Reed and are using non-confrontational techniques. So this is actually a point where progress is happening before our very eyes. but we're bringing up the rear in the United States on that. We can move toward beginning to end unstopped video recording of in-custody interviews, too. That in itself is a vast improvement because it allows a judge and later a jury to hear the actual words that the person in custody and the questioners are saying, and to look at demeanor and tone of voice, expressions, pauses.
So, are you saying that at some point, some of these interrogations, they don't have the camera running the whole time? They're starting it? Or?
That's true in places, and becoming less common as the norm or the protocol becomes just to run the camera without stopping. But there are still places where interviews aren't recorded at all.
Really?
And indeed, any recording is really very recent. Well within the 32 years I've been practicing law. In fact, most of the time I've been practicing, you didn't have in-custody interviews being recorded at all. You had only a police report, a police recounting later to rely on in assessing what someone said.
I think this was an issue for you folks, and do you think there needs to be easier standards to allow defense to provide third-party culpability, meaning you were pretty restricted, right, on saying, well, who else could have done this besides Stephen Avery?
Yes, is the short answer to your question. Now, this is, if you look at all criminal cases, this is an issue that arises only in a minority of those cases. But yes, I see no reason for Wisconsin's asymmetric rule that the prosecution never has to prove motive against the defendant, even though it carries the burden of proof. Mm-hmm. But the defense does have to prove motive of a possible third-party perpetrator, even to be allowed to offer evidence that might raise reasonable doubt that someone else specifically was the perpetrator.
Do you believe capital punishment doesn't work? I was a little bit surprised that I read in your book that capital punishment's been abolished in a lot of places for like 100 years.
In some places, 31 states continue to use the death penalty in the United States. The federal government continues to have the death penalty, and I think we'll eventually acknowledge what the rest of the developed world has, which is it doesn't work, and it doesn't suit people who are interested in pursuing justice and thinking of themselves as just people.
Do you think on the defense side that there's defense abuse? I look at O.J.'s case, which really ended up in jury nullification. They pointed the ball over at the police. Is that just as bad?
It's bad. I don't know that it's just as bad when it happens. Mm-hmm. The idea is that we ought to be getting cases right if we can. If we can get to the truth with some reasonable certainty, whether it's guilt or innocence, that's what the outcome ought to be. The problem is, in all human affairs, getting to the truth is really tough, isn't it? Most crimes aren't committed on videotape.
Okay, we're down to a last couple of minutes. I want to finish up on if you could tell us what the status is of Stephen Avery in the case right now. And you said something in the documentary at the end that was almost chilly to me, which is the poor guy spent 18 years in jail for a crime he did not commit, and he's been in jail for over half his life. And you almost said, I hope that he's actually guilty because he's stuck in there so long. What did you mean by that exactly?
It was a selfish admission. I mean, selfishly.
Yes.
Because I carry the burden of having lost this man's case after he trusted me and Jerry as his lawyers. Selfishly, I hope that the system got it right. That he's at least guilty, given the travails he's had. I've always doubted that he is. I've always feared that he's not guilty.
Well, and obviously I think both you gentlemen showed a lot of class and worked very well with a family that wasn't that popular in that area. Now, I know you've got another book that's coming out. I think it's next year, right? Tell us what it is.
It should be out in 2018 or possibly 2019. The book is going to be called Wobbly, America's Biggest Mass Trial, The Rise of the Justice Department, and the Fall of the IWW.
The Haymarket bombing.
No. That was 1886, and
that was close.
This trial was in 1918, but it was a federal trial in Chicago.
Yes, okay.
Held before the judge who 4 years later became the first commissioner of Major League Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And it was by far, to this day, still by far the largest mass trial in U.S. civilian court history.
Dean Strang, the book, Worse Than the Devil, Anarchist, Clarence Darrow, Justice in a Time of Terror, the next one out in 2018. On our next show, we will look at the nationally unsolved murder of the daughter of a former U.S. Senator. In fact, from my home state of Illinois, I interned for him, Charles Percy. His daughter Valerie brutally murdered in her home while the family slept, still unsolved. Our guest thinks he knows who did it. Thanks to Dean Strang, a class act. See everybody next Monday night on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.